Good. So a warm welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for joining us this morning for the first annual Mobilizing Justice Symposium. For some of you, this is your first time attending a Mobilizing Justice event, so I'll just briefly say that I'm Steve Farber. I'm a professor at the University of Toronto Scarborough, and I'm the project director for the Mobilizing Justice Partnership. And it's my great privilege to introduce the project to you over the first, five or so minutes of the symposium this morning before handing it off to the different folks who are going to be running each session throughout the course of the day. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of the lands that we are on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we each call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. So please join me in a brief moment of reflection to acknowledge the past and present harms our transportation systems have had on Indigenous families and communities, and to consider how we can each in our own way try to move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Mobilizing Justice is a 5-year partnership funded largely in part from a partnership grant from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. Mobilizing Justice coordinates and focuses Canada's transportation research and practitioner communities on the accessibility, participation challenges, and lived experiences of marginalized people. MJ, not Michael Jordan, or not Michael Jackson, depending how old you are, Mobilizing Justice, MJ, is co-developed with the multi-sectoral perspective spanning academia, federal and provincial government agencies, municipalities, transit authorities, private sector firms, and non-for-profit organizations. And we leverage our intersectoral and partnered structure to ensure that research reflects the challenges and goals of our partners and communities, that outcomes are relevant to and put into practice by our partners, and that academic research is integrated into transport evaluation and planning practices to ensure just outcomes for marginalized people. MJ has 3 main objectives. The first is to document, describe, and assess the causes, scale, effects of, and responses to transport poverty in Canada. The second is to develop validated transportation equity standards and equitable planning processes to be used by transport planners, decision makers, and community advocates. And the third is to evaluate solutions to address transport poverty by conducting field experiments and socioeconomic evaluations of smart mobility and transportation policy pilots across Canada. So very quickly, a bit more about who we are. We are an intersectoral partnership. We have municipal and government partners, many of whom are collaborating very intensely with us on individual research projects or providing feedback along the way on the overall structure and purpose of our project. We have a collection of industry partners, many of whom we're partnering with on transportation pilot evaluations for new mobility technologies, but also planning partners and data and GIS partners as well. And finally, we have quite a few non-for-profit partners. Again, a big variety, about on what different partners are doing and bringing to the partnership, but this ranges from being deeply involved in some of our work to opening doors and brokering relationships between key stakeholders across the country who say aren't individually signed up as partners with us yet. The last thing I want to do is I really need to acknowledge some people who have been involved in this project over the last year. First of all, I'd like to thank Shourov for generously funding the project with our partnership grant. But before we begin, I really need to thank Jasmine Moazab and Matthew Palm, the two our project manager and research coordinator, working every single day of the year with me behind the scenes in order to make Mobilizing Justice run. And a special thank you, especially for all of your hard work over the last couple weeks in planning this really amazing event that we're hosting today. So Jasmine and Matt, this project wouldn't be the same without you. And please, everyone, join me in giving them a big virtual round of applause and thanking them for all of their hard work and contributions and passion. It's just been phenomenal. The second people I need to acknowledge is our students and trainees. At the end of the day, so much of the work being done for this project is being done by undergrad, master's, PhD students, and postdoctoral fellows. It's just been incredible to see this cohort of students from universities across the country come together for this shared vision of mobilizing justice. And we're so looking forward to seeing the fruits of your studies and your research projects over the coming years. Next, Mobilizing Justice has a leadership committee that's made up of all of the working group leads across the project. So our project's split up into 6 working groups, and every working group is co-led by an academic and a partner representative. And we meet at least monthly as a team. And I know that the working group leads meet more often than that within their own groups in order to manage research projects across the country. And it's just want to thank you for your support and your leadership throughout this past year, and looking forward to more as we go on. Also, our partners, thank you so much for showing up to our workshops, for joining our working group meetings, for coming to events like this, for reading drafts of our reports and giving us your insights. It's such a fundamental part of the vision for this network that we continue to work in partnership with you, that we co-create together, so that the work that we do, it becomes immediately relevant and useful for your everyday practices as well. All of the other faculty researchers, yes, we've got our working groups, but we've probably got twice as many projects that on the go that we have 6 working groups, and each of those projects has a team of faculty researchers leading and collaborating together with us on. So thank you so much for your efforts, for being a part of this. And finally, I'd like to thank the members of our Community Equity and Advisory Table, some of whom I already saw are here today this morning, volunteering their time to be with us today. So back over the course of the summer, we launched our Community Equity and Advisory Table. We're meeting every 2 months to review our research plans, our findings, to help understand how we can make our work as relevant as possible to communities who are experiencing transport poverty or some form of marginalization in this country. And we're so grateful for the impact you've had. You've already had a big impact on helping us redesign some of the ideas for our big national survey that we're launching next year. And just the project, again, wouldn't be the same without you, and very grateful for your contributions. And, that's really all I had in mind for getting us started this morning. Just a quick introduction to MJ, acknowledging that this project is not about me, that there are so many important people and organizations involved in this, and I'm just continuously humbled and grateful for everyone's participation. So without further ado, I'd like to officially launch the symposium, and our first event is hosted by Professor Meghan Winters from Simon Fraser University, who is one of the co-leads of our Theme 2 working group on transportation modes. And Meghan's been doing amazing work making sure that this project, equally treats and emphasizes the needs of different transportation modes, and especially active transportation modes when we think about transportation justice in Canada. So Meghan, I turn it over to you, and I hope everyone gets a lot out of your participation today and next week.
Sweet. Thanks, Steve and team, for pulling this together. So I am a moderator of this first session, and I'm very happy to start this off with a panel of 5 presentations from our partners. I think it's a nice start to this 2-day annual symposium to hear from our partners first about the kinds of activities that they are all busy undertaking in their cities. So we have, and I'm going to speak a little fast because we're going to stay on time in this session. We have 5 partner presentations that'll go from 11:10 to 12:05 if you're on Eastern time. I want to thank the partners in the time they took to prepare these and in shaping MJ's program to date and all of the meetings they've come to. I'm going to hold us to time in the moderators, so there's a set schedule, and I may come online if things are running over, and then to transition between each speakers. We're going to hold the discussion until the end. There's a discussion response panel that should be around 12:05 to 12:30 Eastern time, but I'll watch for questions in the chat and have Matt and Jasmine help me with that. So with no further ado, the first partners up are someone who I met as MJ was getting started back in 2019. So Fearghal King, and I think is being accompanied by Nicole Geitebruegge from TransLink. So I will let you folks take it away now.
Hello?
Yeah, got it, Fearghal.
Great. Okay, you can hear me now.
Yeah, and presentation, do you want presentation mode?
I'll just turn it into, yeah,
Perfect.
Hopefully you can see that now. Just get my bearings here. Okay. Thanks, Meghan. Thanks, Stephen. So my name is Fearghal King, and I'm joined here by Nicole Geitebruegge, and we are from TransLink, which is the regional transportation authority in Metro Vancouver, if you're not familiar with it. And as our presentation suggests here, we will run through the equity evaluation framework that we helped to develop along with some of our colleagues and consultants over the past year, and also how we applied it to TransLink's recent 10-year priorities, which was adopted earlier this summer. I'll speak kind of fast as well, because I think we have about 15 minutes, and I'll run through some of the approach, the methodology, and hand over to Nicole. So I want to make sure I give plenty of time to Nicole as well. So in a nutshell, what's the 10-year priorities? What's an equity evaluation framework? Why did we do this? All those kind of juicy questions. So going back a bit, TransLink adopted Transport 2050 earlier this year, in January of this year, which is the regional transportation strategy. Essentially the long-range regional transportation strategy for the region at Metro Vancouver, outlining a range of transportation strategies, policies, investments, and initiatives over a 30-year time horizon out to 2050. And the 10-year priorities, as the name suggests, is really the first tranche of that, the first phase of investments. Like how are those plans over a 30-year horizon going to be prioritized over the first 10 years? And the core theme of Transport 2050 was access for everyone, and specifically it outlined, it stated that by 2050, we all have real choices that we can count on, that we can afford, that we can safely enjoy both now and into the future. And beneath those ideas were 4 core goals around convenience, reliability, affordability, safety and comfort, and carbon free. And to support those goals, there were a number of different strategies and actions required to meet those goals. And then beneath that, we had these 3, what we called strategic lenses, around reconciliation, social equity, and resilience. And the thinking at the time of these strategic lenses was that they shouldn't necessarily be objectives in the same way that we see our goals and objectives there, because sometimes objectives can be traded off against one another. And the thinking was that regardless of how we advance the plans and the transportation system over the next 10 to 30 years around convenience, reliability, and affordability, safety and comfort, and carbon free, we should be doing so always with things like reconciliation and equity and resilience in mind. And so while this was stated in Transport 2050, it wasn't until the development of the 10-year priorities, which kind of began a little bit before T2050 was adopted, and the 10-year priorities was adopted then in June of this year. So our task, myself and Nicole, as well as some of our colleagues, was to really unpack this social equity strategic lens. So what does it mean to apply an equity lens to the evaluation and development of the portfolios that are now in the 10-year priorities? So the research question that was tasked, that we faced at the beginning of this process was, do the proposed 10-year priorities, or 10YP, sufficiently promote access to opportunities for equity-seeking groups? So I'll run through the approach, the methodology in a couple of different slides, and then I'll hand over to Nicole. So very quickly, or well, not very quickly, I'll kind of spend a bit of time on this one actually. How we apply the social equity lens is a number of different components to this, and I'll walk you through it. So first of all, we had to think about what we mean by equity, how we define equity. And our thinking was, and still is, that social equity is concerned about transportation-related costs and benefits, including how they're distributed and whether that distribution is desirable. So essentially, really tagging on to the idea of access to opportunities. How are those access to opportunities distributed for different groups around different communities, different population groups around the region, and is that distribution desirable? Does it align to where we want it to what we want it to look like? So to inform whether it's desirable or not, we had to align ourselves to an equity philosophy, kind of a guiding principle. And the one that was handed to us at the time was, and still is now, is to minimize the gaps in levels of access to opportunities between different groups of interest. So there are a number of different types of philosophies that we could have aligned to, things like perspectives like every group of interest has equal access to opportunities, or it doesn't matter what the distribution looks like as long as everyone has a sufficient or minimum threshold, or another distribution that maybe focuses more on maximizing net benefits, net economic benefits. So the one we received direction early on in the process to align to this equity philosophy of looking to minimize the gaps. In terms of who the groups of interest are, we focus primarily in our technical analysis, and there was a non-technical component to this work as well, which I'll get to in the next slide. But for the technical analysis, the very kind of quantitative component of this work, we focused on visible minorities, on seniors, on low-income households, and on Indigenous communities as well. And partially this was because they were the obvious ones to focus on. Partially it was a result of existing sources of robust data. And also there was some kind of intersectionality as well. When we think about seniors, often they can be people with disabilities or other mobility challenges. Now, seniors can also be wealthy individuals as well. So we're kind of, you take the good with the bad essentially here. But we recognize that we're missing some data, and I think I have it grayed out here if you can see that, on things like people with disabilities. Often these things were the result of a lack of data. So I'll get to how we got around that at the non-technical component later on. So how we measure it, when we talk about access to opportunities, which opportunities, we focused on access to jobs, access to education, access to healthcare, and access to parks. Education and healthcare were kind of defined and measured by jobs within education and jobs within healthcare, respectively. As opposed, well, jobs was access to any jobs, and parks was access to like the physical access to parks, including the size of those parks, which is a kind of a proxy for the quality of the parks. And then we also had a number of different metrics related to affordability as well. So we had transportation cost burden, a metric called the burden of car reliance, which is essentially the ratio of access by car compared to access by transit for any given traffic analysis zone or TAZ. And then transportation spending as a percentage of total spending. And then lastly, relative to who or what. So when we do all this analysis, like who are we comparing back to, or what are we comparing to? So the analysis really compared different levels of access for the different groups of interest compared to general population. And we also looked at access by car versus access by transit as well. I mentioned that we had a non-technical analysis to this as well. So we recognized that we weren't going to capture everything with the technical analysis. And so we really wanted to connect with different equity-seeking groups as well for a number of different reasons. So we held, I think, 6 different focus groups throughout February and March of this year. with members of various community organizations. And this was really done for three core reasons. First, to establish ongoing and collaborative relationships with these communities to get feedback, both for this project and ongoing. And secondly, to gather feedback on the proposed equity evaluation framework. So this was our opportunity to share with various groups, our proposed approach to evaluating equity and getting feedback on that approach. And then lastly, and probably most importantly, really tapping into the lived experiences and the challenges faced by various equity groups across the region. So what's important, what challenges do they face, and that in turn can inform our plans and priorities. So the groups that we consulted with for these focus groups were the Disability Alliance of BC, the Canadian National Institute of the Blind, City Hive, Progressive Intercultural Community Services, Senior Services Society, and the Vancouver Aboriginal Friendship Centre Society. And you can see there hopefully who the target population group was among these groups. We actually reached out to about 30 different groups, and this was around late December last year. And the initial intent was to hold these focus groups in person, but at the time we were threatened by the resurgence of Omicron, and that forced us to shift to a virtual setting. So of those 30, 6 different agencies got back to us, six organizations got back to us with interest to connect with them via these focus groups. And it wasn't just the organizations that we connected with, it was the members of those organizations, so directly with the members. In terms of the approach and the scenarios we looked at, it was kind of three-pronged approach. So we first looked at a business as usual scenario using 2017 data, which is the most recent data from the trip diary that we have. And this really covers the basic kind of baseline socioeconomic data, levels of service reflected in 2017. We also looked at a 2035 business as usual scenario. So kind of forecasting out kind of the various socio-demographic trends and population growth, expectations of where we think land use will grow, and then how we think transit service levels will likely improve in accordance with the population growth. So just kind of maintaining basic levels of service in 2035. And then the last one was the 2035 with the 10-year priorities. So it's kind of stacked on top of that, that middle scenario. And the rationale for this was that we didn't just want to look at today, 2017, and then 2035 with the 10-year priorities, but we really wanted to disentangle how much of that 2035 future is owing to what we're likely to see anyway, and how much is likely to the additional investments that we'll see in the 10-year priorities. So hopefully this makes some sense. I will hand over to Nicole. I can continue to monitor to manage the slides here. So Nicole, if you are there, I can see. Okay.
Yeah. Am I unmuted? Everybody?
Yeah, ready to go.
Okay, perfect. So I'll just run you quickly in 5 minutes through some of the key findings. So key finding number 1 was the 10-year plan achieved significant improvement in transit access. So what you're seeing here is access to jobs. As Fearghal said, we also looked at access to education and parks and healthcare, but this is showing jobs. So overall, we see a 52% increase in access to jobs across the region, from 2017 to 2035 with the full implementation of the 10-year plan. And as Fearghal just said, we try to break it down between what would happen if we just do business as usual in 2035 and what happens with the additional implementation of the 10-year plan. So that showed that 28% of that increase, of that 52%, is due to the expected population growth and also due to kind of regular land use changes that we are likely to see between 2017 and 2035. And then the remaining 24% increase is due to the 10-year plan. And you see the maps on the right-hand side. It just illustrates the change in the transit accessibility to jobs on a task level in the Metro Vancouver region. And Fearghal is jumping ahead here, that's okay. Key finding number 2. Now we are looking into a bit more detail for different population groups and the question, do they all benefit similarly? So Fearghal said in the beginning, we looked at visible minority, seniors, indigenous, and low income. And as you can see here, compared to the total population in Metro Vancouver, which is the first bar chart here, where we measured the 24% and the 28% increase in transit accessibility to jobs, you can see really that, or you can see that we are not seeing any significant differences between those groups. They start, if you look at the red bars, they start at a similar height. And then the increases due to the business as usual and due to the 10-year plan are really quite similar across the board. There's no significant differences. So we kind of concluded here different population groups benefit by similar margins. Next slide. So as Fearghal mentioned earlier, we also conducted some focus groups for this study. And we wanted to share one of the key findings that came out of the focus groups. So equity-seeking groups emphasize the importance of facilities and the customer experience to support accessibility, safety, and security. So one key theme that really came up from those focus groups and from the qualitative work is the theme about safety, feeling safe, feeling secure, having accessible infrastructure. And that's something that we didn't address with our quantitative work, but we wanted to acknowledge that this is something that we probably want to address moving forward. Next slide. So just some conclusion and next step. So some of the key takeaways that we had for the 10-year plan. Going back to our research question that Fearghal presented, do the proposed 10-year priorities plan sufficiently promote access to opportunities for equity-seeking group? So on a regional scale, we concluded that the general population as well as the equity-seeking groups, the 4 groups that we looked at, benefit from the general improvements of the plan. And therefore, there's no fundamental changes required to the 10-year plan. But we also acknowledge that there's issues for ongoing work and research. As we learned from our focus group, there are specific gaps in terms of safety and security and infrastructure and facilities, and that we will require more work to reduce these barriers. And we need more prioritization in the implementation of the 10-year plan. Next slide. So the equity evaluation framework served really as a first step to integrate equity to transportation decision-making at TransLink. However, to further promote social equity, there is a need to continue building upon this framework and take stock of lessons learned. So we're taking this framework a step further and continuing to promote social equity in our planning and the policy decision group. So by extending the data collection and data analytics, as in fact, we are developing an equity, diversity, inclusion data analytics program right now as we speak. And then we are expanding the qualitative data collection efforts and community outreach that's in the books as well. And we really want to broaden the application to other parts of planning and policy for example, for transit service planning or other multimodal transportation planning. Some of you might know TransLink is really multimodal, so we want to expand that to other modes as well. And I think that's the end of our presentation. And we are just in time with 15 minutes.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Nicole and Fearghal. So as we switch over, which I think is happening magically behind the scenes, I have one question. Is this public information? Like, did you guys, is there a public document or is it internal right now? Just a quick answer to that.
There's a public document.
Okay, maybe post something in the chat if there's something people can follow up on. Excellent. Okay, so the next speakers that we have are Nick Newstead and Shourov Barua from Infrastructure Canada. INFC has been undertaking a huge amount of work over the past year, and some of you might be hearing about it here for the first time. Over to you.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Megan, and thank you very, very much to everybody within Mobilizing Justice for inviting us today. We're going to be presenting a quick presentation on national spatial accessibility measures. This is a collaboration between Statistics Canada and INFC, Infrastructure Canada, but also other people as well. With that, Nick, let's get going. So just quickly, what are we trying to do here and what is the attempt? As you might or might not know, There's been a significant increase in federal funding to advance active transportation and public transit. So $5.9 billion in the next 5 years and $3 billion starting annually in 2026 and 2027. And what are we trying to do? Just overall at Infrastructure Canada, we're just really trying to make better and more informed decision-making. For example, using either the social lens or the environmental lens or the economic lens, and even employing the equity lens as well, which is part of this project that we're doing. So again, the infrastructure for active transportation can lead to a variety of different components, including increased exercise and public mobility, and also evaluating spatial accessibility to amenities can inform design of programs and policies. It's worthwhile a little bit mentioning right now that we've done additional equity analysis, for example, using the Canadian Index of Multiple Deprivation for analysis of our programs and policies. And we also included that CIMD component into the Green and Inclusive Community Building Fund as well. Just quickly, it's worthwhile just shouting out that there are a number of collaborations between Infrastructure Canada and Mobilizing Justice, including the work on transportation modes with you, Meghan, and Nancy Smith, Lee. And also, a lot of the academics, thank you again, from Mobilizing Justice assisted in these spatial accessibility measures that you, Nick, will touch upon just a little bit later. And also, lastly, the National Survey of Transportation Poverty, which INFC has been a part of as well. So with that being said, Nick, next slide. So just a quick primer before Nick goes into the details. What are we trying to do here? We're trying to calculate proximity. Well, I mean, they're proximity measures, but they're a little bit more advanced than that. Spatial accessibility measures via three groups of transportation, 3 modes of transportation. So what we have is 7 public transportation for peak, 7 public transportation off peak, 7 cycling, and 7 walking measures. And where are they to? They are to healthcare facilities, grocery stores, education, public and post-secondary cultural arts, and I can't see the other part, employment, education, and sports and rec facilities. There are from a number of different sources. The top portion are from Business Register, and the bottom portion are from the linkable open data environment, which Nick has worked on in the past. So with that being said, I will pass it on to Nick. I believe it's you to lead us through the methodology and some of the results.
Yep. All right. Thanks, Shourov. So our general strategy to quantify access is a gravity model. So in a gravity model, we account for the mass of a destination and some measure of distance to that said destination. So in our case, this is the willingness to travel there. So we can think of mass as the attractiveness of a destination. So for example, a customer may be able to purchase a higher quantity or a larger variety of goods at a supermarket than at a convenience store. And so we can weigh these types of destinations accordingly. For willingness to travel to a destination, this is based on the duration to travel from an origin point to that destination, but it also depends on the type of the destination. So a commuter will travel further for employment than perhaps they would for groceries. And again, this also varies based on the mode of transportation. We may be willing to travel further on public transportation than we are by walking. So our general workflow to produce these measures starts with the collection and processing of data sources. Our data comes from a variety of sources. I'm sure I've mentioned some above, but they vary from open data providers to our internal business register at StackN. We then compute the travel time matrices based on the mode of transportation. So this is utilizing transit networks for public transportation and active travel paths for cycling and walking. Following that, we calculate the mass of destinations based on the variables that proxy the attractiveness of the destination. And with this information, we are then able to calculate the measures of access. So as alluded to earlier, the work is only possible due to the availability of a plethora of data sets. So not only do we need to estimate the mass of a destination, but we also need to estimate the willingness to travel. For all modes of transportation, we need to determine how long it takes to travel via the network used by that transportation mode. So this means for public transportation, we need data on the stops, routes, and schedules, which are obtained from GTFS sources and OpenStreetMap. For cycling, we need to know the location of cycling ways, multi-use paths, and roads which are traversable by cyclists, which are obtained from OpenStreetMap as well. And for walking, we need to know the location of sidewalks, multi-use paths, and roads that are traversable by pedestrians. And again, these are obtained from OSM. So to illustrate, we have a map here that shows all cultural and art facilities in Toronto, according to our open database of cultural and art facilities. And here we can see that there are areas where there are dense clusters of cultural and art facilities. This is especially true in the downtown core of Toronto. Now, looking first at access by walking, we can see that DBs in the areas where there are clusters are located. These have the highest access scores. And we'll also notice with walking, we don't have a lot of range, so access drops off quite quickly once we reach areas that there are only pockets of facilities. Looking now at cycling, we can immediately see that more ground can be covered on a bike, and thus the access scores are more spread out in terms of how high they are. And finally, looking at transit, here we see even more even coverage and access. And what I mean by that is that higher access scores are not only limited to DBs where cabs are located themselves, but also to DBs which are nearby frequent and high capacity transit lines. As inhabitants of these areas are able to reach other areas that are outside the range of either cycling or walking. So in terms of next steps, we did a first round of production of these types of measures last year, and we received quite a bit of feedback from academics and researchers in the field. So we're in the process of updating our methodology according to that feedback. We're also working towards publishing this updated data in the near future, as well as establishing a portal that will contain the non-confidential data components that were used in the calculation of these spatial accessibility measures. And that covers our presentation. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Nick and Shourov. As we transition to the next one, I'll just thank you for your time in that these sort of national tools and measures are, I know from personal experience, take up so much time and are very complex in a country as large as ours. And I think it'll be infinitely valuable as they come out and maybe are launched into the next year. Is that what I would say?
That's the plan.
Hoping so. So it'll save sort of researchers and practitioners and community partners as well, just a lot of time that someone else is gonna to put the effort into this. So thanks for working together with MJ. So the next presentation, we're going to zoom into Montreal, and we have Pauline Lambton from Ville de Montréal. You can go ahead, Pauline.
Okay, great. Can you hear me?
Perfectly, and I can see it perfectly.
Okay, great. So hi, everyone. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here. Thanks for the warm welcome, Megan, and thank you again to Jasmine and Matt for the excellent organizing. As I said, my name is Pauline. I'm responsible for the engagement process around the next 2050 land use and mobility plan here in Montreal. My presentation today will highlight some of the aspects of our planning and engagement work. I'll be specifically speaking to certain equity-driven visions we have for the plan, as well as the public engagement work that's been done so far to ensure the plan really represents the needs of different Montreal communities. So first off, a little bit about Montreal. Hopefully this presentation may also serve as an inspiration to visit or revisit soon. Montreal, or for the Mohawk people, Geitebruegge, is one of the oldest cities in North America, characterized by its heritage, history. It's at the crossroads of a variety of cultures that have shaped and that continue to shape the city. The city of Montreal is subdivided into 19 different boroughs, each with their own council and mayor. So you can imagine that for large-scale planning, it's not always easy. Montreal faces some similar upcoming challenges as other cities across Canada and elsewhere, with a significant increase in Montreal's population forecasted, an aging population, the hazards of climate change being felt more and more, infrastructure deterioration, decrease in available parcels of land, and then there's an overarching existence of lifestyle and accessibility disparities that we find across the city. So that brings me to the topic of the presentation today. In the next few years, the City of Montreal will adopt the 2050 Land Use and Mobility Plan, which is a reference document that will propose new ways of developing Montreal and shaping mobility. So one step we felt was necessary to come before this Land Use and Mobility Plan was the City Vision. So the City Vision is a document that identifies the main intentions of the 2050 plan. It raises some fundamental issues, proposes some solutions, sometimes inspired by initiatives that already exist. But most importantly, the City Vision is really a call to Montrealers to take part in defining the future of their city. Oh. So the City Vision is really a foundational tool to set the stage for the engagement process. It asks kind of the tough questions. We sort of know what's needed, but what are we collectively willing to do? What changes are we willing to embark on? And how do we want these changes to occur? The City Vision sets out a handful of pathways to transition, we call them, which are really proposals of how things could change. And each proposal was designed to meet the rights and the needs of all Montrealers. The document is really designed as a tool to reach out and to get feedback, because, well, we believe that all voices, particularly youth and other marginalized groups, should have the opportunity to shape the future of the city. Some specific examples of the proposed pathways to transition are better access to quality and affordable housing in different neighborhoods as a holistic approach to development, ideally projects thought for and by the community, safe and varied mobility options, and neighborhoods that make room for human scale mobility and universal design, and urban agriculture, tree planting, general increase of plants and trees, especially in more vulnerable neighborhoods to counter heat islands. And the details, as well as the other 11 proposed pathways to transition, can be found in the City Vision. I'll send the link in the chat just after the presentation. So this brings us to the engagement process. As I said, the City Vision was designed as the main tool for discussion, but the process is as important as the tools. So in June of last year, we mandated what's called the Office de Consultation Publique de Montréal, or OCPM, to carry out really the lion's share of the engagement process on the City Vision. A little side note about the OCPM. In short, it's an independent and neutral body that's responsible for holding certain public consultations in Montreal. It's mandated by a city council or the executive committee, and then it makes recommendations to decision makers by means of a report. So in our case, the OCPM was mandated to carry out an engagement process on the City Vision with a very clear set of objectives that we gave to the OCPM, which included to meet Montrealers where they are. So that's in all 19 boroughs, even the ones that are far away, hard to get to sometimes, to reach those who are often left out of formal engagement processes, and specifically to create a youth engagement strategy that targeted children that are primary school age, teenagers, and young adults. Because let's face it, the children and teenagers of today are those who will benefit or not from the 2050 plan. So to complement the OCPM process, our team decided to embark on something that's rather new in the city's engagement approaches, which is to consult with even younger children. We know that engagement of the very young often revolves around play, and we mandated an organization to consult with preschoolers in daycares and in local parks to develop an educational play program around urban planning and mobility. And 12 daycares and parks were visited. Over 100 preschool-aged children were consulted with. I even had the chance to observe the process in my son's daycare class with a bunch of 4-year-olds. It was fun and actually very touching. The analysis and report are still underway, but so far the results have been very fruitful and will directly contribute to the OCPM's consultation report. So keep an eye out, and it'll be made public soon. Otherwise, as I mentioned, the OCPM oversees the engagement process along with the mentioned objectives that I said, but our team must continuously provide all the information for their activities. So we knew if we wanted to target certain audiences with regards to urban planning and mobility, namely youth, we'd have to create more accessible and engaging versions of our planning tools, not just documents, ones that would stimulate youth participation, help young people understand that planning and mobility have a direct impact on their daily lives and their way of experiencing the city. So we created 3 short videos to illustrate this. The first one focused on historical and present day disparities within the city and how planning can help reduce them and how to plan in an inclusive way, or some ideas to plan in an inclusive way. Second one, oh, whoops. Can you still see my screen?
Yeah, I can still see your screen.
Okay, I pressed a link. The second one was to address the prioritization of motorized vehicles and how some of that space could be potentially used differently, more equitably. And the third was exploring the links between urban planning and our mental and physical health. So I'll actually leave you with the second video today, since it does make most links between planning, mobility, and sharing space fairly. And I'll send the links to the videos and to the summary of our city vision in the chat and remain available if there are any questions. Thank you.
Pauline. Jasmine, I think you're launching it. Perfect.
Yes.
C'est fou de penser à ça aujourd'hui, mais à une époque pas si lointaine, la voiture, c'était l'avenir. Donc on a construit des routes qui ont complètement transformé l'échelle de la ville. Des routes toujours plus longues, toujours plus larges. Ça a donné des choses comme ça. On n'avait clairement pas les mêmes préoccupations à l'époque, car même si la crise climatique était en train de se préparer, ça n'avait pas frappé la conscience collective encore. Quand on priorise la voiture, on priorise les gens qui s'en servent. Le plus souvent, les travailleurs, les hommes, les adultes en âge de travailler. L'espace occupé par les rues et les stationnements, c'est aussi grand que 18 fois le Mont-Royal. Imaginez ce qu'on pourrait faire d'autre avec ces espaces-là. Les 15 mètres carrés en moyenne qu'occupe une voiture vide stationnée, c'est 15 mètres carrés qui ne sont pas utilisés pour le reste. 15 mètres carrés dont bien peu de gens profitent. Comment est-ce qu'on pourrait réinventer ces espaces-là pour que ça serve aussi aux jeunes, aux personnes âgées et aux personnes à mobilité réduite? Tout ce qui nous entoure en ville est là parce que quelqu'un a décidé que ça devait être là. Comment s'assurer dans le futur que ce n'est pas toujours les mêmes personnes qui prennent les décisions, que les décisions reflètent les besoins de tout le monde? Pour revenir à notre échangeur, des gens ont eu la lucidité de dire que ça n'avait pas d'allure. Pendant 30 ans, il y a eu des consultations, de la planification, des tergiversations, même des manifestations. Aujourd'hui, l'intersection du Parc des Pins est pensée pour les vélos, les piétons, l'université qui est à côté, l'accès à la montagne. On le sait, il va falloir innover pour faire face à la crise climatique. Comment s'assurer qu'on le fait sans renforcer les inégalités, en s'assurant que tout le monde y trouve son compte? Montréal est en train de planifier les 30 prochaines années de son développement et veut savoir c'est quoi tes bonnes idées. Informe-toi sur le plan d'urbanisme et de mobilité 2050 et comment tu peux contribuer.
Nicely done. Thank you, Pauline. I appreciate the long view that you just told us about. I'll also say after 2 years, I finally got back to Montreal this summer. And I want to say in the short term, things are happening so fast in Montreal as well. So just kudos to watching your city grow and develop. And I really like these engagement tools. So we'll post the videos available. I am going to move us on to Matt Davis from the City of Toronto. You can share your screen. We'll make sure it works. Thanks for being here.
Thanks. I'm just trying to get to the screen share piece.
Of course.
I'm actually not seeing it on my window.
It's down on the bottom. There should be a green button. Well, mine's green.
Oh,
that says share
right.
screen.
Yeah, really
Don't worry,
bright.
we all work on different platforms.
Really?
So
Yeah.
when you're on the spotlight, we've all been there. Good.
Okay. Do you all see it?
We do see it. There's probably, right now we can see the bits around it as well. So there might be a slideshow version, maybe under view. Yeah, that's probably it.
How about that?
Yep, perfect. You're ready to go.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thank you everyone for having me today. And I want to thank, I guess, Matt and Jasmine for inviting me and being very patient with me as I put this together. It's been a very busy time here at the city, and it's been a little difficult to kind of balance dealing with equity work as well as our normal everyday stuff. And I think that I just want to say that out loud for everyone else who's working in the public sector, because I think that is a big thing that we need all to sort of recognize in our work here. So, you know, kudos to all of you all who are working in the public sector as well, taking on the equity work, because it is a challenge in addition to everything else we're trying to do with recovery from COVID and the pandemic and everything. So thank you all. I'm going to keep it very short and high level by walking through some of the things that we've been doing here at the City of Toronto, and moving forward, talking about some of our next steps and some of the things that we're going to get into when it comes to equity. So I'm just going to jump right into it. So one of the things that we've done so far, and admittedly, we haven't met in a while with this Transportation Equity Working Group. We actually developed a Transportation Equity Working Group. I think that when we were having meetings, it was very effective in terms of cross-pollination across various units within transportation services to talk about the types of things that we're looking at from an equity perspective. Before we paused this group, and it wasn't paused intentionally, it was just paused just because people got busy. But before we paused this group, there was a effort to start to look at the way we go out to the public in terms of saying, what does equity mean to you, right? And how does transportation services help to deliver that or help to facilitate that in all of our processes and works. So this is a thing that we've done, but it also will be a thing that we will move forward with soon. So this slide here talks about, so I'm the manager of the Capital Projects and Program Unit. This talks about a multi-pronged approach that we've been taking to equity. One of the things that I'd like to, again, compliment some of the previous presenters on is that a lot of you are working from a specific mobility plan or a specific transportation plan, whereas the City of Toronto, we do not have a transportation master plan or anything, at that sort of scale. And so it makes it a little more difficult, but it also provides some more opportunities, because now we're able to look at things at maybe, the master plan is a 100,000 foot level. We're probably at the, 10,000 foot level, right? Because we're dealing with the everyday churn of transportation needs and things that we have to accomplish through our projects that we already have in the hopper, right? So some of these things here, I'm not going to read them all. I think I've talked long enough where you probably can see all of them. But the whole point is that we can't advance equity without looking at a whole 360 approach. There's the data part, which I've heard a couple of times here, and we've talked about that here. There's for us, we try to baseline our projects, and what that means is looking at where we are now in terms of how our projects are impacting areas, or I'll just say benefiting, or if they're benefiting equity deserving groups in specific areas or not. And if not, what can we do to try to change that? Looking at our supplier diversity work, which I'll talk about in a minute, the main thing being, if we're going to be the City of Toronto saying, we're all about equity, our spending needs to reflect that as well, right? So we're looking at this from a very holistic perspective. This has been sort of our North Star, our guiding star for the last year or two, and it will continue to do so until we get some significant progress on all of these tentacles, if you will, of our equity initiatives plans. So one of the things that we've done and we're continuing to do is understanding the difference between when we're doing projects that are request-based versus projects that we know may perhaps people living in certain areas like neighborhood improvement areas here in Toronto may not feel the liberty or the freedom to report to a city agency that they have a pothole, right? Because perhaps they're a undocumented immigrant, right? Or perhaps they have some other sort of bias or negative interaction or negative interaction history with police and government agencies back wherever their old country was from, or wherever. There's all kinds of reasons why they wouldn't report. And so what this slide, it's trying to be somewhat funny, but at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is say, where, can we be more proactive in addressing safety in particular in places where we know things are not being reported, and how do we go about doing that? And so the little bit of detail that I have here today is just talking about applying an equity index to these areas and looking at multiple indicators of safety to try to figure out, again, where can we be more proactive? Where can, these folks are, the folks that are working, the people that are in these areas, they are taxpayers, right? And so we need to be able to respond to taxpayer issues, and regardless of whether they can pick up the phone and speak English or French, right? So that's where we're looking at here. Some of you may have heard about the capital program prioritization tool. I saw Cindy is on the call. So Cindy O helped us with this, and she did a very great job with it. So just want to give her some kudos while she's on the line. I won't go through all this in detail, but one of the things, and I hate to have this come out during this kind of conversation, but I really have to be upfront. The term equity lens, and Cindy knows this, truly bothers me, because it's like, did you do something and then look at it through a special lens to say whether it is equitable or not, as opposed to developing that program with equity as a priority. And we're all guilty of it, because quite frankly, a lot of the policies and procedures and programs that have been in place for years did not consider equity. So it's while it's somewhat appropriate to say I'm going to apply an equity lens, I just feel like we have to start changing into where we have opportunities to create new policies and programs centering equity in that development. And that's basically what the capital program prioritization tool intends to do. So looking at our capital program, like I said, I'm the manager of the capital program here for Transportation Services. We look at what we have, we look at the requests that we have coming in for funding, and we basically assess them using their impacts on various equity deserving communities. I'm not going to walk through all of this right now, again, because I know I have limited time, but one of the outcomes of doing this is to look at, this is what I mentioned about the baselining, look at how we're performing in areas such as neighborhood improvement areas versus non. And again, Cindy helped with this, so again, kudos to her. At the end of the day, what we found in this thing, what we looked at was the, for lack of a better term, the road conditions in neighborhood improvement areas versus not. We actually found that even with the equivalent amount of effort given to maintain the roads, we still saw that neighborhood improvement areas had worse quality pavement. Now, again, I always make this point when I say this, is that, some people say, well, who cares, right? Everybody's roads are bad, everybody's roads are potholes, it's Canada, we all have winter. The fact is, what happens here in the city of Toronto, and perhaps in other cities, is that when we go to do quick build improvements like cycle tracks, or not necessarily cycle tracks, but cycle lanes, or we do bus lanes or something like that, literally impossible to do it on bad pavement. So if you're looking at things to try to improve the use of your roadways, right, or maybe diversify it and make it so that you're being more reflective to vulnerable road users, how do you do that if the pavement's bad? People don't really think about that. But what ends up happening is that totally goes into the ability for a city agency to go in and do something in neighborhood improvement areas. So it's a lot of surrogate measures, but the point is, this is something that's been on our radar now. We see it, we document it, we can move on it. We also have, and again, Cindy was part of this, the Transportation Equity Lens tool development, where it kind of ties into the capital to the capital program prioritization tool. We look at equity from a service perspective, which is sort of how we serve the public. And then we look at a process equity piece. I'm going to focus the next slide is just talking about the service equity piece, because the service equity part is how, and I can let you take a look at this. The service equity part is how we assess the capital program and various projects, looking through these various, from the perspective of equity deserving communities. And so we look at transportation needs and barriers, the positive equity impacts of the project or program, the negative equity impacts, and the negative impact mitigation. So what we're trying to get at here is, we think it's positive. Let's put this down and figure out what kind of barriers are there. What are the positive impacts? Are there negative impacts? And usually that's where it stops with agencies. But now we also have to include the pieces. Well, we know there's negative impacts that perhaps we can't avoid. How do we best mitigate them? And all of these are brought into the conversation about the prioritization of the capital program year to year. Another thing that we've just started recently is looking at, so this is an example of our neighborhood cycling and equity index that we've developed here at the City of Toronto. And for the most part, what we're trying to do is look at our cycling network plan, and we say, great, we have the cycling network plan, we're trying to be aggressive on it. I know cities like Montreal are way ahead of us when it comes to how you guys are rolling out, so very good on your part. But for us, we're looking at it and we're saying, we have this large plan, how is it prioritizing the needs of equity deserving groups? Now, one of the things that I'm sure you all know about here is that there is a lack of data, right, in terms of who qualifies as a vulnerable road user, who qualifies as a equity deserving group. So we're limited at this point to looking at neighborhood improvement areas here at the City of Toronto. But looking at that, we've sort of blended, and we can probably have a conversation offline about it, blended the idea of a cycling deficit, if you will, cycling facility deficit, as well as the conditions in the particular neighborhoods, as in, are you in a neighborhood improvement area or not? So because it's not good enough, right, to say that you're in a neighborhood improvement area. So what, right? You're in a neighborhood improvement area. Yes, that means we're supposed to focus more attention so that we can lift the folks, if we can, out of that neighborhood improvement area, not moving them, but improving the area, right? It's a neighborhood improvement area. The point we're trying to make here is, not all neighborhood improvement areas are in cycling deficit, and not all neighborhood improvement areas are in transit deficits. So it tends to look at the blend between these things and try to figure out where we really do need to be prioritizing resources to deliver the cycling network plan.
Great, thanks, Matt. Can you give us 1 minute wrap?
Yeah, sure. So this was just an outcome of that work. We have transportation equity opportunity zones, which again is a follow on to what you just saw, but it's more or less looking at equity deserving groups, transportation disadvantage, transportation burdens, and neighborhood accessibility and spatial inequality. We're going to be moving on that. The equity impact scoring tool. I just needed to mention this, Megan, because the folks at U of T really helped us with this, and we just really want to thank you all for moving on. This is an example of what we were going to use for automatic speed enforcement locations. So again, more to come on that. And the vendor diversity initiative, which we could talk about in terms, basically all this means is we're going to do a lot better in identifying opportunities for diverse suppliers to work with us in the actual engineering and planning, not just selling pens and pencils and coffee mugs. That's it. Sorry for if I ran over.
No problem at all, Matt. I mean, I want to just, as we switch over, I want to thank you for sort of speaking openly about sharing your challenges and perspectives on it. I think it's probably a shared experience. And in addition to the very many things that are going on in the City of Toronto around equity, I think it's helpful to know just it's a shared struggle, and I'm sure other people will speak to that as we go forward. So I think we're going to, just so everybody knows, I think we'll extend just a little bit into the break that we had planned for the discussion panel. I'm just giving you a heads up now. But the final speaker in the panel will be Caragiale from Metrolinx, please.
Good enough, Caragiale.
Thank you. Sorry.
Don't worry about it. Okay, I'll try to figure out how to share my screen. Okay, just give me 1 second. Matt, I wish you had gone on for longer. I was just really
I know. I felt terrible.
Thanks.
We'll probably follow up with all those questions too that of the slides we got flashed to us. Okay, so if you want to be in full, perfect. You're good to go.
I think that should work. Okay, well, so hi everyone. My name is Caragiale. I'm a manager at Metrolinx in the project planning team. More specifically, the project planning team deals with planning of new rapid transit infrastructure and also regional rail expansion. I'm going to be focusing on a very specific part of the equity work at Metrolinx, which is the work that we do in business case analysis. And I'll echo Matt before I forget. Thanks, Jasmine and Matt, for your patience with my busyness and the bureaucracy that I had to deal with. Thank you also to Drs. Farber, Klumpenhauer, and Allen for all their advice and their help with getting us moving. And mostly thank you to my colleagues and my staff who are so passionate about this and really working, like Matt said, just beyond their day-to-day duties to make this happen. So I'll start, sorry, I just need to adjust my screen so I can see my content. So I'll start by giving you a bit of an overview of where we're at with Metrolinx. And for those of you who don't know, Metrolinx is a provincial transit agency in Ontario. We were created in 2006. And we plan, we deliver, and we operate transit. We operate some transit, obviously not all transit. And I will note that I'll say our mandate has vastly expanded since 2018. And so we have been growing really quickly, which I think you can probably appreciate is always a challenge when you're trying to bring about cultural change and objectives such as equity when you have to grow and deliver more and more work. In terms of the planning division itself, so that's the division that I'm a part of, I've listed here the different sections of it. Research and planning analytics, those are our economists and our travel demand modelers. Project planning is my team. We have a service planning division that's looking at a long-term service expansion. And regional planning, they work on the network planning as well as really transit integration policy as well in the long term. So at Metrolinx, all of our transit infrastructure projects require business case analysis, and I'll tell you a little bit more about this. What's happened so far is that in 2019, in the Ontario Line IBC, for the first time, we looked at impacts to low-income communities. That's something that wasn't done before. And also Dr. Farber and Dr. Allen authored a report about the socioeconomic distribution of travel time and accessibility benefits for us. This was very much the first time that we were doing any of this equity evaluation for our projects. Since then, with the pandemic, we've been really working through continuous improvement and undertaking economic research. And this year, I think we were starting to see more change. For me, a big one was really seeing equity embedded in our strategic objectives, which sounds like a small thing, but again, having that leadership support and organizational support is always very important in our world. We are implementing standardized equity metrics in our strategic case, which is part of the business case, and our economic research is nearing completion as well. All right, so just a bit of an overview of the business case framework. It's one of several components in decision making, and it is the evidence-based tool for decision making. The idea is that we have a standardized framework, and that allows us to have a consistent and comparable approach to all project evaluation. And then we do a new business case, or we update the business case throughout the delivery life cycle. So from the moment the project is identified as a priority, where we do the initial business case, until after it's in service. We haven't gotten there yet, but that's the idea. So we can keep track of the benefits of the project and its impacts and make sure that we're moving in the right direction. In terms of what's in a business case, it's 4 cases providing 4 complementary perspectives on a project and 4 types of analyses. The strategic case really adopts more of a policy perspective and focusing on the objectives of the project. So we tend to have a mix of quantitative and qualitative metrics that explain why the project should be pursued, or as I like to say it more so, whether or not the project should be pursued. The economic case will look at economic impacts to society and compare that to costs. You often will hear us talk about BCR, benefit to cost ratio, and that is one of the key metrics in the economic case. The financial case looks at how the money will be spent across the life cycle for the project, sorry, and so how much it will cost in financial terms, and that's usually the case that's mostly used for discussions around funding and investments. And then the deliverability and operations case talks about exactly that, constructability, construction impacts, and also operating requirements. So as I said, one of the big steps that we've taken this year was introducing standard metrics for our strategic case. It really is the case where we have the most flexibility to do work. So here are the four metrics. We have equity of access to opportunities. Traditionally, we've been looking at jobs. We're starting to also look at education, and we're hoping to extend beyond that to also other types of community services. And so the idea is, yes, we do it for the total population, and we do it for low income populations, but we're also expanding to new demographic categories, or not new, should I say, more demographic categories and more equity deserving groups. So including racialized communities, low unemployed communities, seniors, etc. So that's equity of access to opportunity. Then we do the same thing with looking at impacts to different socioeconomic groups for station access. So how many people are expected to live within walking distance of those new stations that we are creating. Then equity of travel time savings looks at how much time transit users will be saving thanks to the new transit investment. And again, here you can see it expressed for different categories. And finally, the last one is the equity of additional utility from transit trips. Hopefully I can explain that one clearly, but essentially it looks at the how many trips are induced because of the investment, and compares that by zone with the demographic, the different demographic categories to understand the attractiveness of transit. What I will say about those four metrics is, first, we've really just started using them. We're still working on the methodology and making sure that we understand how to pull the numbers, that they make sense. We've just done the analysis on one of our business cases that will be released in the next few months. So we're really excited about that. There are some caveats that we are trying to address. I think the biggest one is probably that we talk about trips and population density in 2041 or 2051 soon. So we're looking far into the future when we pull numbers. However, the distribution data that we have is all 2016 or 2020 now. And so there is that dissonance between the two, and we're trying to figure out how to take that into account, or how to adjust maybe the methodologies to account for that. And the other thing that I think a lot of people mentioned is also the lack of data. Really, we really wanted to look at people with disabilities for some of our projects, and that's not data that we were able to obtain. So working through that will also be important as we move forward. The economic case is also trying to bring some changes about. So I'll just stay at a high level here because I'm not an economist, but there's 4 different approaches that are being researched right now, and none of those have been decided yet or approved or finalized even. So the first one is the value of time approach. And so it's looking at modifying the value of time for different segments of income. The value of time comes into play in the economic case, is that we look at how much we assign a dollar value, I should say, a dollar value to the value of time, and we use that to monetize, as we say, to express the benefits to people in dollars. So this is looking at adjusting, and so that value depending on the income level, and that will be captured through the travel time saving benefits. The next one is accessibility approach. So in this one, we'll look at the added utility of expanded choice. And so we're going to be capturing that through utility of accessibility. For induced demand, the idea is that additional trips, so I think it goes back to some of the discussions earlier about utility, some of additional trips happening because of the investment, and looking at what that value is or who is impacted the most by that. And then the labor benefits approach is looking at something that we're still working through, is the wider economic benefits of a project. So beyond just direct transit benefits, and looking at how that improved access to employment can impact different income ranges at the regional level.
Lee, can you give me 1 minute wrap?
Yes, that's my last slide. So as I said, we're doing work to refine what those metrics. We do have a working group, for example, started in project planning to try to refine our approaches. For us, it's more than just a business case analysis. It is about how we use equitable principles to plan the projects before we even evaluate them in a business case. And I think that it has to start there. There's also discussions around public consultation and how to do that better and to do that in a way where we can have enough information to make the right decisions. And I think that'll be fairly essential to us improving our equity metrics. So yeah, I think that's about it. That's where we are at right now. Hopefully I can give you an update in a few months, and we'll have a few more achievements to spotlight.
Excellent. Thank you, Lee, and thanks for navigating all that bureaucracy to get that out. I certainly understand everyone's working within their own systems and that people have, multiple competing interests right now. So we're going to bring in the panel right now and ask people for about 20 minutes from now for our discussion. Press. Well, I tried to put the bios in the chat. We'll see how that goes. Pardon me. So there's 3 of us on the panel, right, or 3 guests on the panel right now, which I think are coming into spotlight. I think what we did, the panel I did send them some questions in advance, sort of from my previews of the slides. So thanks to the partners for sharing that early. I'm going to ask the panel to sort of just go ad hoc, but give quick answers and just weigh in as you see fit. I think we really heard some really valuable perspectives, experiences, and examples from specific cities about their activities, or Statistics Canada about their efforts in making tools. And I'm just wondering from the panel, your sort of perspectives on how we can grow this energy. So the question I sort of sent in advance was around how can we spark sort of those major shifts that we need right now, like action towards these major shifts to support climate, equity, and sustainability goals. So these are all really great initiatives happening place to place across the country, I think we saw from the partners. But just sort of your quick or high level thoughts on what we need to sort of spark major shifts forward. Who wants to go?
If I may begin, I was actually very impressed by what Matt shared, Matt from the City of Toronto. What I really liked about what he was saying is that it's not enough to just approach something from that singular lens. I really like that analogy that he used. It's really about bolstering the sort of systems and looking at these processes from the very beginning. And I think if we apply that sort of thinking to, that intersectional perspective of not just about equity, but climate and sustainability, I think that's like really essential. It's not enough to say we're looking at things equitably, but really going down at a granular level, I think is like super important. And I really liked how Matt was challenging that. It wasn't enough to say that we are being equitable. He wanted to get to the real deep levels. And I really liked the way that the neighborhood improvement areas were used as a metric of understanding of that.
Can I add to that? I underlined Matt's comment there as well. So Matt, I think you provoked many of us in the way that you explained that. I think you're spot on. Maybe I can try to be a bit provocative here and play the professorly role of pushing this a little bit as well, which is, I think in this country, we're fabulous at making plans. And the data that is being collected and what has been described is remarkable. I mean, this is a quantum leap, and I think this group should be really proud of how it's come together and is working towards Matt's invocation for all of us, not to see equity as a lens, but as central to what we're doing. I think at the same time, when you look at many of the actions that are actually taking place, they're not following through on this. And I can think in our region here in Greater Toronto, we had an election just recently, which essentially was a referendum on the role of the car in our city. There were two major highways on the ballot, as well as a model of growth that would continue to build in an auto-oriented way. That model won in a landslide. And those projects are now proceeding, two major highways, plus increasing sprawling development into our green belt and on and on. And you can find the same thing taking place to varying degrees in cities like Vancouver and Montreal. So I think what we really need at this moment is for this group to be thinking, how do we communicate all of the data and turn that into the real sea change of ideas that's going to be required, not just from the expert community, but from our wider communities at large. How do we connect with people who either are not wanting to connect or who we haven't had the tools and the languages and the venues to connect with? I think that's really what this group, which has such a wide reach from coast to coast to coast, I think that's really a place where this group could play. One last thought is around urgency. This is a moment that requires great urgency. I mean, you hear at every turn how there's anger in various quarters across this country. And again, we've talked about many of the plans are, you know, the 2041 plan for Metrolinx, or plan for 2050, or plan for 2060. That is a long way out. And there are people today who are getting angrier and more frustrated and more dislocated, and in response are turning to solutions that really are in many ways antithetical to a greater equity focus. So I think a sense of urgency and really trying to redouble our efforts to connect and then to move a whole lot faster towards the equity goals that we're talking about is what's needed here.
Great. Kevin, can I ask you to pick up? I wonder if you want to talk about communicating this data. If you don't have something else to say, you might have something to say about how can we communicate this data that tackles a sense of urgency. I'm thinking about USS Montreal, but.
Well, great. Well, I'll get to that. I just to kind of go off on what Matti was saying, and then also just my response to some of the speakers today. I was very impressed by what most of the speakers had to say here, or all the speakers had to say, and one thing that really stood out is how much these metrics have improved, how much the data collection has improved. I mean, I remember when I started sort of doing this research into equity and transport, 15 years or so ago, and there obviously were some folks, maybe even on this call. I mean, Howard Martins was already doing great stuff, and Aaron Gellin and Karen Lucas and people, but it was a very, we were kind of in the wilderness, or kind of pioneers in what we were thinking about. And one of the things that we noticed, some of the work with Ahmed from 15 years ago, none of the plans in North America or that we looked at had any kind of clear definitions about these metrics, about distribution across groups. And what Fearghal and Nicole were talking about, and Matthew, these really clear definitions about what are the impacted groups that we need to think about, what are the clear definitions of success. What Fearghal was talking about with the clearly identifying specific philosophical grounding of saying we want to minimize gaps. It's not a vague sense of equity. It's clearly identifying groups and clearly identifying an end result that's desirable. So I was really impressed with that kind of work, and also the explicitly bringing in youth voices, that what Pauline was talking about. I think that's something that's really important. Youth are people that don't vote, right? And so they have no way to. It's very difficult to get those voices into planning and policy. So I'm really impressed with what's happening, and do agree with Matti's call to make this into reality. We now know a lot more about how to measure these things, how to conceptualize these, and there's people on board. These major transit agencies in Canada are on board. They're at this meeting. I think that's already great step forward. In Montreal, the current administration is very progressive and forward-looking in terms of what they're thinking about transit, and being explicit about equity, which has been a great move forward. And I will try to address your question, Megan. So yes, so the work that you're doing, the work that we're doing together, in terms of is a really good way to bring data to the public through, we have a public-facing website now, Sus Montréal, which is, again, very, trying to link these things through a series of maps and bivariate, multivariate analysis about things like accessibility and quality of bike lanes and walkability as it relates to various groups in society. And I'm happy to share that link to people. If that's appropriate, but I think that these kind of forward-facing, public-facing websites and things, I think, are very good to get that information out there, because I do think there's an interest from both policymakers and the general public. So I think I've taken my time. I'll stop there, Megan. Thank you.
Good. Okay. Another question just came to mind, which wasn't on any of my lists, but in the presentations today, I heard a number of sort of hints or indications of times when city governments or national governments were working with academics and partners in order to do this work and spark new ideas or generate data products in helpful ways. So I heard that from the Metrolinx conversation, I heard it in the Toronto conversation, I heard it in the INFC and Staff Can presentation, and I personally have had many conversations with TransLink. I guess my question to this panel, thinking about sort of mobilizing justice and our other associated projects, is how can we sort of better help them, or what do we need in order to be like at the table and be able to sort of serve up and support local governments, community organizations in doing this or advancing their on that?
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to that. I think actually, Megan, your comment was right. Like, it's already happening, and it's remarkable when you hear woven through all of the presentations from the transit agencies how much this work has been appreciated and integrated into their thinking already. So I think that's remarkable, and I think a lot of this is through networks and through an ecosystem, and knowing that university partners and our broader collaborators are there to provide support and have the tools and the resources that can contribute. And I think it's clear it's already starting, and building that culture of sharing of information and recognizing that how academics work, that our work is to provide independent evidence that goes where the data says, and the tools and building the tools that can help with that work. I think academics can sometimes play a nice role as an outside entity for organizations that may have their own internal pressures to provide an outside view that can share information that might be harder to produce internally. So I think there's a lot of potential, and I think it's already happening, which is just great to see.
I should say academics and consulting agencies for sure. I also recognize that we sort of had words from the larger Canadian cities at the table today, but especially for communities that may have less resources and capacity, I want to ensure that they also remember to be invited along in this process. So I think we have about 5 more minutes from the panel. It looks like we've lost Masooma, but we can pick up on these. Maybe any comments from Matt or Kevin on, I think maybe we should pick on how do we know what works well for different contexts. So I am interested in hearing about different kinds of contexts. Is there any sort of comments that you have on how do we know what works in different kinds of settings or for different equity seeking groups? Do you want to pick up on that in any way?
Sure. I think there's at least kind of 2 important things to consider here. Is it kind of goes back to some of what I was talking about earlier. I mean, there's in terms of how we know it works, there's one, having clear indicators and metrics to understand, sort of internal, was this successful according to what we had planned is one kind of base level of what's important. Was this successful? Did it specifically meet what we had set out? As I mentioned, with these, specific groups that some of these plans have been, and specific outcomes. And then probably more importantly and trickier to deal with is then understanding, and I think this came up in one of the presentations as well, but then thinking like the sort of 4 metric approach that Lee was talking about, in terms of, but looking at what are some of these outcomes in terms of whether that's activity or participation, whether that's satisfaction with transit service, whether that's other quality of life or well-being indicators, which are obviously harder to get at, whether it's employment outcomes. And so I think that's something that I think MJ has talked a little bit about. Maybe we can go a bit more in terms of what are those sort of broader outcomes. It's not simply accessibility, but then it's also how people experience that. It's how people look at other sort of quality of life outcomes and so on.
One of the things, just answering my own question, that I heard in the presentations today was also sort of that taking different approaches. So TransLink's work to try and build in those focus groups and qualitative work. And I think what I heard them say was sort of how to integrate that more formally into their process. And I think, certainly for different kinds of organizations that might be focused on quantitative analysis or business cases, sometimes these are new perspectives, but really important to capture the lived experiences. I heard that in Montreal as well, sort of accessing the sort of voices of the youth and even down to preschool and child. And I think as we move forward in work I do on climate justice, of course, it's the future generations that are very front of mind. So that was nice to see today. Maybe as a closer to this conversation, I'll end with sort of what are the rubs you see in this work or what opportunities? So if there's anything you just want to highlight as a final piece, Matti, could I speak to you, or any final words you have for the panel?
Yeah, the final word is just to keep pushing. I mean, it's clear from the attendance and from the conversation that was sparked that it's happening, that the network effect of a big partnership is what's starting to already bear fruit. And I think the key and takeaway for me is to really continue to be ambitious, to see this as a group that can help raise all boats and share information, learn what works, then have the evidence and the people locally who can tailor it and find what works in different communities. Meghan, you mentioned earlier that today's focus in the talks was mainly on from our larger city participants. Some of what works in larger cities may have real variations in mid and smaller sized communities or in the north or in indigenous communities. And we need to really make sure that we're tailoring all of the solutions. And the nice thing is that this group has representation and it has geographic spread to be able to take those lessons. So I would just say this is a fabulous start and just keep pushing.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll agree with that. I think that's a great great takeaway for today and for the last year of work that MJ's been doing. Getting so many people around the table, in industry, in transit agencies, academics, partners. I mean, it's great to see, and it shows how seriously this is being taken. And also, just thinking about how if we think about this ongoing kind of evolution or progression of sort of adding, thinking about planning as Masooma's back here for her too. So I'll be quick. But
please don't mean to throw things off. Please go ahead, Kevin.
And so thinking about how 20, 30 years ago, just with the sort of influence of kind of environmental type goals and thinking about transit agency not just being there for efficiency or for economic vitality or for moving cars, but thinking about broader sustainability and environmental type goals. And then moving on, I think the next step that we're living through is more bringing in these equity goals and bringing in these kind of this sort of justice perspective of that's becoming more accepted and normalized by of course we need to think about the pollution impacts. Of course we need to think about the broader sustainability impacts, and of course we need to think about the distributional impacts and equity questions. So I think that's a great step forward, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Masooma, we were just doing final comments from this panel, so if you just want to give me a minute of your final thoughts, skipping over whatever you might have missed.
Sure. Yeah, I think when it comes to conversations about, all this stuff in equity, I think we like to think really big. And I always push back on two things. One, when you look at data, it's amazing how much data has improved and how much of it we actually have now. But the one thing I always like to push back on is where's that data coming from? who is included in the collection of that data? Is it encompassing everyone that we need? Because often we'll get the data, we'll take it at face value, and then we'll go forward with it. But really moving backwards and saying, who is included in this process? Who had to have a say? Who was captured? Because if there's often the case is that that data is not capturing everyone. And if we continue along with it, we don't scale back and think about that, then our innovation doesn't include a bunch of folks. And then as we innovate on top of that, we tend to leave these gaps that only widen over time. And then the second point is also about innovation. Again, we tend to think really big when you talk about, innovation and technology and using these tools as a way of fixing problems. Something in the Montreal video I found very interesting at the very end was that innovation and technology can make these things better and can solve a lot of problems. But often it has the opportunity to make things worse if we don't look at the smaller scale underlying problems that we have. If we are advancing things like creating open systems, right, to get people onto transit, being able to pay with their credit card, but we're not looking at who doesn't even have access, who is unbanked, who is underbanked, who doesn't have access to get, the same way that I can go on my cell phone and top up my Presto card. Some folks don't even have access to a Shoppers Drug Mart nearby because their neighborhood is considered, the Shoppers doesn't want to be in that area. Really going down to the scale and seeing folks and speaking to people. Another thing that I really liked was, I believe it was TransLink, and the way that they have not only looked at things from a quantitative perspective, but made space for qualitative research as well. And going to people and speaking to them, not just groups and not just, looking at research and data, but really having conversations with people who may not be captured. Again, that's example for the 311 calls. If we are waiting for people to come to us and then using that data, we're never going to create truly equitable systems. We have to go to people in a way that works for them on their schedule and on their time to really understand things from a holistic perspective. And that's the very last point I almost left it, is a spatial perspective. Usually there's always a spatial pattern to these things. In the city of Toronto, it's very clear. I've been very vocal about this, but I love to look at what is what's happening at the intersection of equity and spatial analysis, because usually there is a connection there, and we learn so much by looking at these two things in a matrix. So those are my thoughts. Again, sorry for my technical difficulties, but it was an amazing panel, and I'm really looking forward to more symposium.
Great. So thanks all for being here, for the presenters who put time into their sessions today, and I'm sure sort of set us off for thinking for the rest of today and the next day, following next week, next Wednesday as well. So at this point, we're going to sign off from this panel. There's now a 20-minute break, and we'll be back on at the top of the hour. So I look forward to seeing you all then, when we'll go through some of the MJ achievements thus far.